Well, we are once again in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, and there is so much to see here. It's taking us multiple episodes, so make sure you hang around. We have a lot left to learn, and we're learning a lot, so I mean that's a big deal. So we do have a lot left to learn, and I hope that you stay with us as we continue through Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. All right, we are in Cape Girardeau County, next to the Mississippi River, here at the City of Cape Girardeau Fort D Historic Site. And they've got a nice replica here of one of the fort buildings. This site was one of those instrumental in protecting the Port of Cape Girardeau. All right, Fort D. Fort D, one of the four forts erected in Cape Girardeau by Union forces in 1861, is the only one preserved. Its site southeast of the town was chosen to command the entire bend of the river southward and also the river road from downstream. Inclined embankments were built with ditches on the outside. A rectangular gun emplacement projected diagonally at each corner. These earthworks may still be seen. We'll look at those. The soldiers made a bowling alley on the terrapin of the fort using huge sticks of wood for pins and 32-pound cannonballs to bowl them over. During extremely cold weather, some of the soldiers dug caves into the steep hillside north of the fort and became temporary troglodytes. But most of them decided the extra comfort did not warrant the extra work. Troglodytes. Don't hear that word very often. Grant takes command. In April 1861, Ulysses Simpson Grant, a graduate of West Point and a former Army officer, was out of the Army and clerking in his father's store in Galena, Illinois. Grant's loyalties were clear. We have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. He volunteered with the state of Illinois and was made colonel of the unruly 21st Illinois Infantry in June 1861. Organizing them into shape, Grant moved the regiment into northern Missouri, where the soldiers helped maintain order. There, Grant learned a valuable lesson about his opposing commander as a group of Confederates fled before a fight ensued. I never forgot he had as much of a reason to fear my forces as I had his. Grant was given command of the post at Ironton, Missouri, where he received his official appointment as Brigadier General early in August 1861. He was sent to Jefferson City, Missouri, to prepare the city for an expected attack. When the attack did not occur, Grant was ordered to St. Louis to receive important special instructions. These instructions sent Grant to Cape Girardeau to command the District of Southeast Missouri, including all of southern Illinois. On August 30th, 1861, the man who was a store clerk just 5 months earlier took command of the Union Army in Cape Girardeau. Eventually, this army would be known as the Army of the Tennessee and led by Grant and William T. Sherman, would win battles at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Champions Hill, Vicksburg, and Atlanta before its last major battle at Bentonville, North Carolina. In 1869, Grant became the 18th President of the United States. However, while in Cape Girardeau in 1861, he was unsure of his future. From the St. Charles Hotel, he wrote to his wife and asked for her support. You should be cheerful and try to encourage me. The safety of our country depends upon my acts. Uncharacteristically, he continued, all I fear is that too much may be expected of me. The 20th Illinois Regiment. The 20th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment was formed in northern Illinois in April and May of 1861. On July 10, 1861, the regiment disembarked from a steamer at Cape Girardeau, the first formal Union troops to arrive in the city. One of the volunteers was Alan Morgan Gear, well-educated 21-year-old. He reported that the troops marched up through the pretty village about twilight and that the citizens were orderly and well-behaved. Another member of the 20th, Ira Blanchard, was impressed by the greeting they received. Men, women, and children crowded around, waving hats and handkerchiefs in token of their joy at our approach. The reason for their joy was made apparent to Blanchard. They were, as a rule, loyal, yet they had been constantly plundered, threatened by rebel bands, and now they saw their relief at hand, rejoiced at the presence of the Yankees. While stationed at Cape Girardeau, the 20th made numerous expeditions and patrols to outlying areas and fought at the important Battle of Fredericktown in October 1861. The citizens of Cape Girardeau, impressed the soldiers, and acquaintances were quickly made. Gear wrote articles for the local newspaper Eagle. He also wrote that he and a friend called on some nice girls who welcomed us, they said, because we acted like gentlemen. Eventually, the 20th was called into the action. Blanchard wrote, "We bade farewell to the beautiful Cape, its beautiful houses, its beautiful women, and steamed further down the Mississippi." The 20th went on to fight at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, Kennesaw Mountain, and Atlanta. The remnants of the regiment served as provost guards during the March to the Sea. The 20th ended the war at Raleigh, North Carolina, and later marched in the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C. In May 1863, Gear was severely wounded at the Battle of Raymond near Vicksburg, Mississippi. He served throughout the rest of the war. Later, he became a lawyer in Warrensburg, Missouri, where he died in 1926. A Confederate bullet still lodged in his spine. So these are some of the pictures on this one. Cape Girardeau in 1861. There's the Battle of Shiloh and the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. There's Alan Gear himself. The Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C. and the Battle of Raymond, where he was injured. Saving Fort D. After the Civil War, the forts and earthworks of Cape Girardeau slowly disappeared as the city grew. Finally, only Fort D remained. In the early 1900s, the area surrounding the fort was developed as Fort D Highlands. A campaign by veterans, concerned citizenry, and the local newspaper kept the fort intact as the lands around it were developed. In the 1930s, the land was purchased by the American Legion and the Works Project Administration and approved a project to stabilize the earthworks and build a replica powder house to be used as a museum and meeting house in the center. Finally, the renovated fort was reopened as a park in 1936. 75 years after it was originally built, the museum, designed in a fort-like style, has become a landmark in the city and is representative of WPA architecture. Over the years, the fort and museum fell on hard times, being used for many purposes far from the original designs, including use as a private residence. Finally, with the threat of demolishing the remaining walls of the museum, public entities and private organizations stepped forward to bring new life to the site and interpret Cape Girardeau's role in the Civil War. And you can see the corner there that was Fort D. And up here, some old photos, and you can see how disrepair and the area around, and then what we currently have now. Marching with the First Nebraska. At the beginning of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln requested states raise 75,000 volunteers for troops. In response, the First Nebraska Volunteer Infantry Regiment was organized during the early summer of 1862, partially in order to replace Army troops stationed in this territory. However, the entire regiment ended up being called to action and arrived in St. Louis in August 1861. After spending some months in action against Missouri irregulars, the 1st Nebraska was heavily engaged at battles at Fort Donelson and Shiloh, Tennessee, and the siege of Corinth, Mississippi. Late in 1862, the regiment returned to Missouri, where it participated in a winter expedition traveling from Pilot Knob, Missouri to Batesville, Arkansas, and back. In March 1863, the First Nebraska relocated to Cape Girardeau, which was a pleasant respite. The regiment was comprised of frontiermen, and alcohol was frequently available. A German immigrant and member of the regiment, August Schernickow, tells of getting paid at the St. Charles Hotel. The paymaster was in a pool hall right under the headquarters. On the pool table, the greenbacks were thrown toward us. There were drunken men immediately, since there was money again, as well as beer and brandy. Traveling down river on an expedition, Schernickow relates, farther around the peninsula rests the Catholic Seminary, high up and beautiful, an attractive building. On the other side, we caught a glimpse of our old camp until the bluffs and walls of Fort D removed it from our view. While in Cape Girardeau, the regiment was well fed. Schernickow, I've said that 3 different ways, I think, noted the food being unloaded at the wharf, including hard bread, flour, grits, smoked bacon, and sugar-cured hams, rice, coffee, tea, dried mashed potatoes, sugar, vinegar, and salt. On April 26, 1863, the 1st Nebraska formed the main infantry force that repelled rebel forces during the Battle of Cape Girardeau. According to Schernickow, the troops advanced so close to each other that they shouted out insults. During the summer of 1863, the regiment was again stationed at Pilot Knob, working on what became known as Fort Davidson. Later, the regiment would be sent to Arkansas and remounted as cavalry. Recalled in June 1864, the regiment's steamboat stopped at Cape Girardeau. Appreciative townspeople greeted them, and wild handshaking took place between citizen and soldiers. After burying a sergeant who died on the trip, Schernickow relates that the citizens handed out beer and whiskey to the soldiers. Upon departure, there were several very drunk men and quite a few very tipsy ones. Several men fell into the water as the boat departed, and brawls could not be avoided. The 1st Nebraska ended its Civil War service in an action against Native Americans near Fort Kearney, Wyoming. Schernickow married and moved west to Oregon, where he died in 1923. Down the Colorado. Work on Fort D began on August 6, 1861, under the direction of Lieutenant John W. Powell of Illinois. Later, Powell recruited a company of loyal Cape Girardeau men to serve in the Union Army. Since Powell was from Illinois, these men were mustered in as Battery F, 2nd Illinois Light Artillery. After training for several months, the battery was sent up to the Tennessee River to Pittsburgh Landing, near a small chapel known as Shiloh. During the Battle of Shiloh on April 1862, Powell gave a command to fire by raising his hand. A bullet shattered his wrist, and the arm was later amputated to stop infection. In 1869, one-armed John Wesley Powell led the first successful navigation of the Colorado River through what Powell named the Grand Canyon. All right, Unwanted, Untrained, and Indispensable. Their names may not be recorded in the official records, but thousands of women volunteered their time, labor, and money during the Civil War. As a teenager, Julia Gill, a future resident of Cape Girardeau, volunteered her services as a nurse, traveling with her aunt, one of the Sisters of the Holy Cross Order, to the hospital in Mound City, Illinois. As hospital ships such as the USS Red Rover arrived, Gill cared for the sick, wounded, and dying. She received a pension for her services, and her tombstone in Old Lorimer Cemetery reads, U.S. Army Nurse. Among the first troops to arrive in Cape Girardeau in 1861 was the 17th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, including Lieutenant William S. Reynolds and his wife, Belle. As a newlywed, Belle made the decision to follow her husband's regiment, including its campaign in southern Missouri and on the river during the fall of 1861 and winter of 1862. On April 6, 1862, she was near a little log chapel known as the Shiloh Meeting House in Tennessee when we were startled by cannonballs howling over our heads. As Reynolds rode to battle, he asked, "What will you do, Belle?" She took on the role of nurse and protector of the transport ship carrying the wounded. After the war, she pursued a medical degree and traveled as far as the Philippines as a representative of Clara Barton's Red Cross. Cordelia Harvey, widow of the governor of Wisconsin, volunteered as a sanitary agent and wrote, "In the fall of 1862, I found myself in Cape Girardeau where hospitals were being improvised for the immediate use of the sick and dying, then being brought in from swamps by the returning regiments and up the rivers in closely crowded hospital boats. These hospitals were mere sheds filled with cots as thick as they could stand, with scarcely room for one person to pass between them. Pneumonia, typhoid, and camp fevers, and that fearful scourge of the southern swamps and rivers, chronic diarrhea, occupied every bed." In November 1861, during one of General Grant's visits to Cape Girardeau, Captain John Wesley Powell, commander of the forts, asked for a leave to marry his half-cousin, Emma Dean. Married on November 28th in Detroit, the newlyweds traveled back to Cape Girardeau for their honeymoon. April 6, 1862, found Emma at the dock in Savannah, Tennessee, as a transport ship brought a badly wounded West back from the Battle of Shiloh. She cared for Powell as he recovered from the amputation of his arm. For the remainder of the war, she traveled with her husband in the Army, serving as a nurse when needed. She died in 1924 and is buried with her husband at Arlington National Cemetery. There's Belle Reynolds and Emma Dean Powell and Cordelia Harvey. And there's the USS, I'm sorry that the camera's in the picture. USS Red Rover and the hospital ward on the Red Rover.
This marker is for Fort D, 1861. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. Let's take a look at the fort itself. .32-pounder Seacoast Gun. Reportedly, Fort D was armed with 3 32-pounder smoothbore cannon model 1829 and 2 24-pounders model 1819. A 32-pounder can fire a solid round shot weighing 32 pounds for nearly a mile. Such a shot required a load of 8 pounds of gunpowder. These massive cannon were originally designed for the seacoast forts to protect ports from enemy ships, presumably belonging to foreign powers. Since there was no exterior threat during the Civil War, the cannon were distributed to forts and armories across the country. Many of these forts and armories fell into the hands of Confederate states, so both sides were well armed with antiquated yet powerful weaponry. The smoothbore cannon were not as accurate as later rifled cannons, such as were made during the Civil War. Still, such cannon could be expected to hit the proverbial broadside of a barn at a goodly distance. The cannon were also capable of firing shells which would blow up in flight after a fuse burned down, or they could fire canister or grape, which were smaller sized projectiles contained within a cylinder. Some of these large cannon were mounted on barbette carriages that swiveled, while others were mounted on siege carriages with wheels. Either way, moving the cannon from place to place was an ordeal. The 32-pounder and carriage weighed over 10,000 pounds. Bowling for boredom. Rarely being on alert and never under attack, boredom and disease were the biggest enemies of the soldiers serving at Fort D. Soldiers passed their spare time reading, writing letters, playing cards, sewing, gambling, or playing music. Games played include baseball and pitching horseshoes. In one recorded episode at Fort D, soldiers constructed a wooden bowling pins from blocks of wood. They then used 32-pound cannonballs as bowling balls on a makeshift wooden floored bowling alley. One of the soldiers, Benjamin Radford, commented, "They were effective when hit and gave strength to our arms." Troglodytes. During the winter, some of the soldiers stationed here dug shelters into the hillside. One soldier reported that his mess of 4 men built a covered shelter measuring 10 feet long by 8 feet wide. The top was covered with dirt, and a stovepipe chimney stuck out of the rear. To the soldiers, these shelters resembled artificial caves, and the men referred to themselves as temporary troglodytes or cave dwellers. Since digging and building the shelters was hard work, many of the other soldiers preferred to spend the winter in their tents. Quaker Cannon. In order to help dissuade potential attackers, some Union soldiers shaped and painted logs to make them look like cannons from a distance. Since these cannons could not fire, they were called Quaker Cannons after the Quakers, a peaceable religious group that generally declined to fight. Since Fort D was rarely threatened, it may be that the soldiers building the cannon were simply fighting boredom by having fun at the expense of their opponents. Their real cannon were enough of a threat. And then here's one of the Quaker cannons.
Well, that brings us to another episode on Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, historical markers. We still have more going. There's more to see here, so stay tuned with us as we move on to another episode of historical markers in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri.